Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. I'm Dave Reed. In December, Haymarket Books published Palestine, a Socialist Introduction, featuring essays from a number of activists and thinkers inside the Palestine Solidarity movement. The book was edited by Sumaya Awad and Brian Bean. Sumaya is the Director of Strategy and Communications for the Adalah Justice Project. Brian is a founding editor of Rampant Magazine and is a socialist activist and writer. Our US Correspondent Michael Arria spoke to Sumaya and Brian back in December when the book was released.
So in the introduction to your book, you talk about this left socialist movement that's emerging in the United States. And I think a lot of young people have been drawn to socialism as a result of recent domestic issues and events, whether it's the pandemic or, BLM protests, the Sanders campaigns, the explosion of DSA. I'm wondering what you'd tell somebody who has only recently come to these kind of politics or has only recently been exposed to socialism about why an internationalist framework is so important when it comes to socialism, and also why Palestine is such an important part of that framework specifically.
Thanks. That's a great question. So I think for any socialist movement that really wants to go up against capitalism, especially capitalism today, and all its globalized networks, you have to have very strong and principled internationalist politics. And what I mean by that is a grounding and an understanding that our liberation will only become a reality if we're all free. And I think for us here in the US, this burgeoning socialist movement that has a lot of power and a lot of potential, and that's growing very, very rapidly, has a lot at stake in terms of whether or not it's going to come to terms with the US's role internationally and how that comes back into domestic policy, that foreign policy is domestic policy. So I think first and foremost, that just means acknowledging that the U.S. became a state through displacing and colonizing existing indigenous nations here that were here long before European conquest. And I think it's especially important right now because we're seeing every excuse under the sun being leveled against poor and working class people in this country for why they can't have Medicare for all, for why they can't have a minimum wage, and a number of other things. And the reasons constantly, there's not enough funding. Where are we going to get the funding from? But then you only have to look at the U.S. defense budget, the bloated Pentagon budget, to really ask yourself, well, we're spending so much here. I mean, the U.S. spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, billions and billions of dollars. And actually, post 9/11, the whole quote unquote war on terror period that lasted from then to now, the U.S. has spent over $6 trillion on war on terror. And to what end? Killing people overseas indiscriminately and justifying all sorts of brutal regimes around the world, while here domestically, we've just seen things get worse and worse. And the infrastructure of this country is just rapidly crumbling. So I think that's the first reason that I would give for why internationalist politics is so important, and why it's crucial that we understand that our liberation is tied with the liberation of the working class beyond our borders, everywhere. The second thing I would say specifically for Palestine is that the U.S. helps prop up Israel's regime both financially and politically. Israel gets $3.8 billion a year from the United States in military funding. And it's part of a 10-year deal, $38 billion over 10 years that actually Obama and Biden signed back in 2016. In fact, Joe Biden actually flew to Israel to make sure that that agreement was approved by all the necessary parties. And this is military funding. And there's a particular clause in this agreement that necessitates that a certain percentage of this military funding Israel has to spend on purchasing U.S. weapons. So this military funding that Israel is using to oppress, to colonize, to occupy Palestinians is also coming back here to hurt us here because it's leading to the hyper-militarization of the police here, of our cities, of our schools, of campuses, etc. So that's one for why Palestine specifically. Another really important thing is that as socialists, one of the most important things is that what we believe, what binds us together is our class politics, right? The working class together is what will build a new kind of world, build a new and different system. And what that means is standing with the oppressed outside of our borders. And with Palestine, it means listening and heeding the call of Palestinians to boycott Israel and apply pressure until it ends its occupation, until it allows Palestinians their right of return, until it dismantles its apartheid wall. And as socialists, what this means is that we cannot cross that picket line. There's a call to boycott. We need to listen to that call. We need to boycott until Israel is held accountable. I think that's the second thing. And we've seen in the US this attack on the boycott movement, in communities and schools, on the local and state and federal level. There's an all-out war on those who advocate for Palestinian freedom. And it doesn't look like Joe Biden's going to change anything when it comes to that. His Secretary of State that he's going to appoint, Anthony Blinken, has already made it clear that he is going to fight tooth and nail to ensure that Palestine advocacy is criminalized, or he's going to attempt to criminalize it. So I think that's what we're up against, and that's why it's so important here in the U.S. to talk about this and to fight for this. And I'll just end by saying, one of the harshest and most violent crackdowns on socialist movements in the U.S. was in the 50s and the 40s and the 50s and 60s, with the attack on socialist organizers and communists. And it was during this McCarthy era that so much happened that we can actually see parallels in today when you think about how the Palestine movement is being treated in the U.S. Many have, I think, accurately said that the latest incarnation of McCarthyism is what we're seeing with the Palestine movement in the U.S., from blacklists, smear campaigns, deportations, harassment, isolation, etc. So I think it's really important to reckon with that and think about how this hurts all of our movements. The Palestine movement doesn't exist in isolation, and so we need to stand up for it and make it and integrate it into our organizing for any sort of system change to be possible in the U.S.
Your book, in addition to kind of providing this great contemporary analysis, it's also grounded in history and kind of serves as a history lesson for people maybe learning about Israel for the first time. Labor Zionism was this pretty popular current of Zionism, maybe the most popular current at a certain time originally. And because anti-Semitism was such a huge problem in the late 40s throughout the world, there was this kind of confused, contradictory reaction to the creation of Israel from many, not just progressive groups or liberal groups, but socialist groups too. And in some ways, Zionism was associated with socialism by some people. That perception kind of continues when you read some of the analysis. Can you maybe talk about the historical relationship between socialism and Zionism and kind of share your thoughts on some of the contradictions that have been at work there, and maybe push back on some of the history that we've heard about that relationship?
I'm glad you asked this question because I think, on Twitter, where the magic happens, a lot of the Zionist first attacks on the book have been to say, but wait, Israel's socialist, and sort of that nonsense. And so it's very much a live question, even though it's a historical question as well. And so I'm glad that you asked it. And as you mentioned in the book, there's 2 chapters that really go over this much more in depth. But I think briefly, that there is this left-wing gloss to the Israeli state. And that comes from the fact that the Labor Party and its forerunner, the Workers' Party, the Land of Israel, were in name and lineage left-wing. Both these parties and the Confederation of Hebrew Labor were instrumental in the founding of the Hebrew state, the Israeli state. But of course, that founding was of violent ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, of massacres, the land theft of the Nakba. And many of the major perpetrators of this atrocity came from the labor Zionist movement. Many officers in the Palma, the Haganah militias who carried out these atrocities, and subsequently the IDF, were members of the party. David Ben-Gurion, of course, is a name that people sort of know. He comes from that tradition. And every Israeli prime minister before 1977 were members of labor. And so, from this tendency that, has its roots in the socialist tradition, despite the fact that it has sort of gone tremendously off course. And that, I think, has caused some of the confusion in which, now the Labour Party, I think, is still in the Socialist International. And so some people sort of see it because of this long connection. And the grim historical irony is that despite the growth of Jewish socialist currents, that they're rooted in the oppression of anti-Semitism that was rampant. You mentioned the 1940s, but I think that its roots come from the rampant anti-Semitism, particularly in Eastern Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. That experience generated like a radical current of struggle that came to connect with the ideas of socialism as a means to try to end that oppression. But I think that the notion of Zionism was certainly not monolithic in that movement at all. The Jewish Bund, which is the largest Jewish left-wing organization, was explicitly non-Zionist, as they considered it as a retreat from the fighting of anti-Semitism. I think that is the key element that I think is this division, and that is that the whole underlying assumption that undergirds Zionism is that anti-Semitism is natural and eternal, that it can never be defeated, so it can only be remedied by withdrawing from general society and forming a separate state. That's really the underlying sort of assumption of Zionism. And it's important to note, like I mentioned, that this was, for a long time, a minority position within the Jewish movement. And Zionist figures like Herzl and Chaim Weizmann wrote explicitly about how they saw the socialist movement as their competitor to the sort of more formal Zionist movement. There's this quote in our book where Herzl was meeting with the Russian Tsarist head of police, and he was looking for the Tsar's help to get the Ottoman Empire to give them land. And he said, help me get land and the revolt will end sooner, referring to basically the socialist movement that was threatening the Tsar in Russia. And so will the defection to the socialists. So basically, if you help me get this land, then I'll try to sort of detract from the connection of many Jewish radicals to the project of revolutionary socialism. So labor Zionism is this defeatist approach to fighting oppression that says we can't actually defeat it. We have to sort of retreat from it and sort of build our walls up. And those walls, sadly, are not figurative, but quite physical. And that then is used to justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Because if one thinks, hey, we as a group can't join together with our class to defeat our common enemies, then you get this situation that is quite bleak of oppressed group against oppressed group. And that is basically a right-wing position that requires racist justification, and that's what became of labor Zionism. And so this racist justification, I think, is at its core, too. So, for example, Bir Borachov, who's considered the founder of labor Zionism, and sort of symbolized its left wing against the right wing that was of Dave Gurion, and his writings never referred to Palestinians as Palestinians or even as Arabs. He only called them citizens of Palestine because he argued that they lack any national culture and purely adopt a national culture higher than them. Those are direct quotes from him. Those are racist positions that strip Palestinians of their identity and say they sort of can't have that. And it's those sort of racist assumptions that's used to justify the ethnic cleansing that went on, carried out a lot of by people who considered themselves left-wing. And of course, there's another vision to that, and that we saw in Russia, that in some ways is a key country for the Jewish socialist movement. And like while sections of labor Zionism went this defeatist road that I described, you also saw the Russian Revolution that overthrew the Tsarist regime by the Bolsheviks, who did things like outlaw anti-Semitism and who had a disproportionately high number of Jewish leaders like Leon Trotsky. I think that's stunning if you understand that this occurred in Russia, which at the time was probably the most violently anti-Semitic of countries before the rise of the Nazis, where there were horrible pogroms that were carried out regularly by fascist gangs. And so the Russian Revolution showed a different sort of revolutionary path to sort of fighting oppression. So there's a lot more that can be said, but I think that in sort of closing on this question, labor Zionism is in some ways, I think, a dead branch, that it has helped build a settler colonial state. And there's no such thing as labor Zionism anymore. There's only settler colonialism.
Many assume that the Biden era will just be a repeat of the Obama years in many ways when it comes to things like foreign policy. But there's a real distinction between where the left is currently versus where it was when Obama was elected. And that includes Palestine. There's going to be more Congress members next month who support conditioning aid to Israel, for instance. How do you envision this battle kind of playing out between the Biden administration and the more left voices within the Democratic party over the next 4 years?
So I think to start, it's important to really underscore that Biden and certainly the cabinet that he's forming, at least from what we know so far, are going to stray very little from the Obama years and what we saw and experienced under Obama. And in that sense, they're, the slick boardroom Democrats that are out to ensure that the status quo is what we go back to. And I think that, this is like people like Nancy Pelosi and others in the establishment. Unlike back then, though, and you're right to point this out, there's this brewing left, I think, in the Democratic Party. And whether or not it will continue to grow in what direction it will take, we have yet to see. But I think there's certainly a lot of potential and a lot of things that point to a real threat within the party. This is people like AOC, people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, people like Cori Bush, who just won from Missouri, and Jamal Bowman in New York. And then even on the local level, there are also a number of people running, and many of them explicitly socialist, that are offering a different type of campaign, a different program that is anti-capitalist, and that does integrate internationalism, that does integrate a more critical more criticism of U.S. foreign policy, past and present. So I think that's important to sort of put out there. I think that in the U.S., because there's this increased polarization that we're seeing, that we certainly saw with the election, it's going to mean that there's going to be a lot of emphasis on these, left-wing progressive figures in the party and what they will do and how far they will push for the agenda that they put forward, whether it's a Green New Deal or canceling student debt or conditioning aid on Israel, etc. But I think there is a lot of promise. At the same time, the Israel lobby and different Zionist movements in the U.S., I think we're thrilled that Biden won, because it meant that he could reestablish the bipartisan consensus on Israel. And this was really key for them, because 4 years of Trump really helped the Palestine movement begin to win the ideological war, showing what Israel is and what Netanyahu represents, and just how ingrained racism is in Israel's project. And having Biden back, this, slick Democrat up there that can talk diplomacy while really just allowing Israel to continue to expand its occupation, to continue to indiscriminately kill Palestinians, and get this blank check from the U.S. So Democratic Majority for Israel, which is a group that was actually formed very soon after some of these left and progressive voices won seats in Congress, its entire goal is to reestablish support for Israel within the Democratic Party. It's pouring a lot of funds and a lot of energy into reestablishing the bipartisan consensus on Israel. But so much has changed in the last 4 years. And these changes aren't sudden. I mean, they've been building for decades, decades of Palestine organizing on the ground here in the US and in Palestine, the strength and the growth of the boycott movement. And it means that, the liberal base that the Democratic Party establishment has really relied on to bolster its support for Israel, to continue sending these blank checks, it's starting to question why the U.S. supports Israel so uncritically. And it's starting to make connections between the fight against racism that's growing here in the U.S. to Israel's project. It's connecting foreign policy to domestic policy. It's connecting different components of this left movement that's burgeoning here in the U.S. around racism, sexism, immigration, climate change, healthcare, and the list goes on. It's making these connections to Palestine, to what's happening overseas. And I think that's really, really key. And that's one of the reasons that it's not going to be easy for us to just return to the status quo on Israel-Palestine. I think at the same time, actually, I'll point to just a few examples of why I think this is true. I think one of the best ones that just happened more recently, or the most telling ones, is with AOC when she pulled out of the an event memorializing former Israeli military general Yitzhak Rabin back in September. I mean, this was pretty massive. She had said she was going to go, and then Palestinians called her out and said, "Wait, this is a military general. This is someone that helped to orchestrate the 1948 Nakba. This is someone that participated in ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. This is someone that was very cozy with some of apartheid South Africa's leaders. Why are we memorializing him at a time when we're criticizing and tearing down statues of all of these racist, violent figures of U.S. history?" So I think the fact that she said she met with first, she spoke to Palestinians and then said, "Okay, I'm going to pull out," and sort of retracted her earlier statements is huge. Having someone in that position say, "I was wrong," and I'm listening to the people that are usually not listened to, that are usually sidelined, isolated, and silenced, and doing so publicly. And she got the wrath of the Democratic Party establishment. So I think that's just one example. There's so many more. I mean, Cori Bush, who won her election, she spoke out about the boycott movement just 3 days before her primary. Just a few years ago, you really couldn't talk about Palestine in general, but certainly not if you were running for office. It would usually be the thing that you just avoided completely. And now that's changing slowly and changing. And it's we don't know where it's going to go. I'm not saying that means our work is done, far from it. But it means that things are slowly changing, and that the decades of work of organizing on the ground are starting to pay off very slowly.
Everything that Sumaya said about the changes and the ways in which I think the integration of the question of Palestine in the umbrella of progressivism, I think, brings out certain contradictions between the Democratic Party and sort of its base are sort of notable. And I think that there will be this slow progression, but I think at the same time that will also, I think, speak to deeper questions about the Democratic Party as well. And so, the party, despite its base, is still a party that is run by big business. And, if wars of politics carried out by other means, then politics is economics carried out by other means. And so, the ruling class and the capitalist backers still see Israel as key for maintaining imperialism. They still see the integration of the Arab states' economies and Israel as a positive thing for business in the region. They want these things to sort of continue, and that means continuing in the normalization. That means continual ostracizing of the Palestinian sort of cause. And so I think that the slow accumulation will also, in my opinion, also require a break that I think is a break that is calls into question the capitalist imperialist nature of the Democratic Party.
There's this University of Maryland poll that we reference a lot at the site, which showed that 50% of Democratic voters who have heard of BDS support the movement at least somewhat. And this is in contrast, obviously, to what we see from elected officials. Even most Democrats who come out against anti-BDS laws and say that they violate the Constitution usually also go out of their way to denounce and condemn the BDS movement as anti-Semitic, further fueling the anti-BDS laws themselves in many ways and giving them some rhetorical cover. Can you talk about the importance of taking that extra step and supporting BDS? And I'm also just wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can expand the BDS movement into more mainstream forums, like, say, labor unions. Obviously, your book's about socialism, so I was specifically interested in that context, how we can bring this idea of boycotting Israeli goods to a place like the labor movement.
I'll start, and then I think Sumaya will have a lot to add on this one as well. But I totally agree with you. I think that the BDS movement is probably the most important factor in this sea change that I think that Sumaya described, this change in how people see the question of Palestine as being under the umbrella of progressivism, and has moved it away from where it was for years, which is basically a third rail of politics. It's something that you didn't talk about it. But now I think because of the BDS movement, it is now seen in this list of progressive causes that people are fighting around, even though it's still, fiercely contested in some ways. And you describe some of the pushback against that as well. And I think that a large part of it is that its framework is based on the human rights situation of the plight of Palestinians and calls into focus the corporations in the states that collude with and even profit off of these abuses. And it also provides its clear demands to end the occupation for the full legal equality of Palestinians and the right of return. So it pairs these, I think, very digestible and things people can connect with easy asks and tools that people can do to build campaigns wherever they are around central messages. And I think sort of in addition to all the things that we can cite, like the poll, as far as how BDS has shifted sort of popular opinion, I think that how much Israel communicates that's threatened by BDS reflects how powerful it is. The fact that, Mike Pompeo's visit to an Israeli settlement last month and Trump's official designation of BDS as anti-Semitic are sort of the parting gifts of the Trump administration is not accidental. And while externally the Israeli state sometimes, tries to downplay the effect of BDS, when they're speaking amongst themselves, they're quite clear that it's seen as a threat. And the very fact that the Israeli state, funds social media campaigns and funds interventions on U.S. campuses where BDS is the strongest, I think speaks to the fact that the movement to kind of call into question the normalization to delegitimize Israel, I think is an important thing. I think, what to do. I think that's a real important question to ask. And I think that we have, in some ways, a long way to go. The BDS movement in the United States, which I think is different than elsewhere in the world, has been, I think, strongest on college campuses. But I think that to really expand it, trying to get it into labor unions is key. And I think internationally, we've seen this been done quite successfully. Places like in Scandinavia and France and in England, like the large national trade union federations have endorsed BDS. Farmer unions in India with like millions of members have backed BDS. And so I think that the US is sort of behind the ball on that. I think has some catching up to do. And I think that like how to do that is, part of it is just trying to sort of fight these campaigns. And part of it is trying to fight to bring political fights into unions. I think because of in some ways, the defeats that the American labor movement has taken over years, our unions just don't fight as much. I think that's changing. We have seen the wave of teacher revolts. We saw at the beginning of COVID, particularly in the healthcare and in the education sectors, people engaging in strikes and actions to try to make conditions safer. And so, when you're able to fight around your own conditions, that's the territory that you can begin to bring in more political fights. And that's key. I think it's not accidental that a union like the ILWU dock workers on the West Coast was the union that called for a day-long strike in solidarity with the Black revolt against police violence this summer. And they're one of the unions that refused to unload Israeli ships during Israeli attacks on Gaza. And so I think that the ability to politicize your work and to say, hey, this is not just about our wages, but this is about the fact that actually, workers ourselves can have says in things, and we have the power of the strike weapon, I think are important things to sort of bring into that. And I think one of the things that will help that, I think, is really like political education. And this is something that we hope our book is a contributor to. Like, if you're going to go into your workplace and, argue that you should endorse BDS or break this contract where your retirement or your pension is invested in an Israeli company or a US corporation that profits from Israel, then like you need to be able to take on the argument of is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic, the one that's often countered, of being able to sort of describe to people what's going on and answer these key political questions that I think exist. And so political education, doing reading groups with your union comrades of our book and sort of books like it, and how to sort of politicize your workplace as much as possible is, I think, sort of seeding the ground to be able to carry out more intense, specific fights on getting BDS resolution passed in unions.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is 100% true. I think like at the heart of it, the reason that the boycott movement is so important and that the attack on it has been so vicious and so well funded is because boycotts work. And people know that. People know that boycotts work. And history has taught us that in so many different ways. And in some ways, a strike is a form of boycott. When workers are like, no, we're not going to work. we're not giving you hard labor, and strikes work. And I think that's one of the biggest threats to, to capitalism, but, to the US and just these systems reproducing themselves. And I think that's why it's such a threat when there's a boycott movement. And that's why when students on college campuses here in the US say things like, we want to have a BDS referendum, we want to have a BDS 101 talk, it's treated as an all-out attack. And students are, some of them are suspended. There's like a whole disciplinary thing that happens with it. It becomes a very big, momentous thing for what you would imagine would be like a very simple, students, activists on campus. So I think that's one thing that I want to put out there. The second is what the boycott is demanding. The demands of the boycott are also very important, because it's not just saying we want to hold Israel accountable in some abstract sense. It's saying, no, these are the things we're demanding. And Brian listed them, but I think one of the ones I want to focus on is the right of return. I think the fact that one of the demands is the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, to their land, is very, very important, because that puts into question Israel as it stands right now, as this ethno-nationalist state, right? It completely ruptures that. That's the second thing I want to point out. Third, I think with the labor movement, one of the main reasons that it's just really weak in the labor movement is that the labor movement in the US has been very weak for some time now. And so I think as it grows, so will a more like internationalist, and Palestine will be part of that framework, and campaigns within it. So I think that's to me, that's like the main reason why it's weak in the US labor movement. That said, there have been attempts by many, many Palestine and labor organizers in the US to organize around boycotting Israel, and around sort of raising awareness and education about the role that US unions play in helping to bolster and sustain Israel's apartheid regime. And they have all been met with very vicious and violent attacks, and people losing their jobs, people being completely sidelined and isolated. And so it's and there's a lot more there that I won't get into, but it has been tried, and I think that's really important. Although now we're seeing this new generation of workers, and this sort of renewed passion and politicization in the labor movement that I think opens up a lot of new channels and opportunities.
My final question: we've seen the country gripped by protests this year. By many metrics, the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder were the most popular demonstrations in the history of the country. Can you talk about the parallels between what's happening here, what's happening in Palestine, the need for establishing those connections across the two countries, and also just kind of what you've seen this year that has kind of inspired you on that level when it comes to those connections? I'm
going to come at this from a weird angle maybe, but so I think that in thinking about the protests this year in the United States that you mentioned, or the New York Times said was the largest social movement that the country has ever seen. And I think was a level of militant unrest that we haven't seen since at least the late 60s and the early 70s. And it spoke to, I think, a core element of this country, which is this country is founded on and continues to operate off of anti-Black racism. And that Black people in the country are the sharp edge of, receive the sharp edge of a U.S. state that operates in the interests of billionaires, and will violently maintain that rule however they see fit. And I think that the police presence in Black communities is just the most glaring example of this. And people reacted to that. I think that people reacting to that are also reacting to the situation around COVID too. I think threw these things into stark relief, in which you saw, complete federal inaction, still allowing, hundreds of thousands of people to die of something that could have been prevented, and giving out trillions of dollars to maintain the profits of corporations. And so there are these contradictions that I think are made starkly apparent by the government's response to COVID. by the everyday brutality that Black people face from the police. And so this kind of rottenness of the status quo, I think, is something that people obviously experience all the time to different degrees. And when people see that you can do something about it, it's quite infectious. When the people in Minneapolis refused to stand down from police repression and, lit things on fire, people responded by saying, oh, we can actually sort of fight back in our own communities. And, the protests around George Floyd obviously transformed to talk about anti-racism generally. It brought the notion of defunding the police into something that is discussed in sort of popular culture and whatnot. And so I think that is what happens when people begin to stand up and fight against systemic injustice. And I think that the protests that we saw over the summer, I think, are also connected in a way to things that happened internationally the year before. So 2019 was a year of global protests. I think sometimes those connections are lost a little bit because when COVID hit, basically most of them sort of stopped. But there was this notion, there was this wave of protests from Chile to Haiti to France to Algeria to Sudan, Lebanon, Hong Kong, that basically characterized all of 2019. And there was this sort of, when's it going to come to the United States, And it did, but after some of the others were kind of forced into submission by the pandemic. And so I think it's like, that's an important, I think, context for one of the arguments that we make in the book, which is how the liberation of Palestine will be carried up by these mass uprisings, particularly of the Arab working class. And that's the engine that will sort of bring about the liberation of Palestine. And I think, we see basically the echoes of the future of what will be required to occur across the globe to be able to sort of force the hand and change the power dynamic and the status quo, not just in sort of Palestine, but elsewhere. And so, the wave of revolts that we saw that really originated in the Middle East with the revolution in Sudan and Algeria was the second wave of the wave of protest of the Arab Spring, which of course, next week is the 10-year anniversary of the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi, which kicked that off. And those protests were connected to the movement in Palestine. The organizing in Egypt began with solidarity demonstrations with the Palestinian people in the Second Intifada, along with the flags in the revolutionary squares of the countries where they were occurring. There were the flags of Palestine. People saw the question of Palestine as being the most obvious sort of example of Western and capitalist domination of the despots that rule their countries, etc. And so I think that sort of the promise of that, of global mass revolt as being something that can, exert change, I think is something that is important for us to sort of grasp on, like people continuing to protest, to continuing to build mass organizations, to be antagonistic towards the state and sort of the status quo that will try to sort of sweep these changes into policy halls and sort of all that. So I think that sort of, that I think is some of the connections that we would make from that.
I guess two things I'll add. The first is that I think this last period has really made it clear that people don't trust their governments and people don't trust the status quo and see it for what it is. I think more clearly, I think, than ever before, at least in the recent past. And I think that the protests over the summer, the Black Lives Matter protests and the rebellion, coupled with the revolts that we saw sweep the Middle East and North Africa in 2019, building off of the Arab Spring in 2011, all point to this wave after wave after wave that is leading towards some sort of system change. It's not inevitable, and I think it's really important to underscore that it is not inevitable that we will win, that the left will win. But I think it certainly is possible. I think history has taught us that. The question is whether or not, well, one, we're up against climate change. So the question of will we, how far will we get before it's too late and our planet ceases to exist in any way that allows us to survive. Then there's also just this question. I mean, right now we're in this extremely polarized moment where the right wing is growing rapidly and is confident, and not just in the US, but globally. And then at the same time, you have this growing left movement. Some of it is characterized by socialism, in other places it's not. But it is growing, and it asserts itself every few years in different places across the world. And I think when the two come to head, which is happening in some places, but I think there's going to be there's tension building towards a point where the two are going to come to head. And at that point, there's going to be a question of which will prevail. And I think making sure that we integrate internationalist politics in all of our organizing in the US, but elsewhere, anywhere in the world where there's a left and a progressive movement, is key to ensuring that when we do reach this point where the two are up against each other, that the left will prevail. And I think making sure we're all connected is the way to do that, is the way to sort of go up against this right-wing global movement that is extremely connected. I mean, they are very well connected to one another financially, politically, and in every way possible. And I think our side has yet to catch up.
Like preparing for the fights is something that Sumaya sort of hit upon. I think that's really important because the conditions don't go away even when the sort of uprisings diminish, and there's the experience and the knowledge of those uprisings occurring. And so, next week there's another anniversary, which is the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of the Sudanese revolution, which kicked off the second wave of the Arab Spring. And the event that kicked that off, of course, was the people of Sudan's anger with Omar al-Bashir normalizing relations with Bashar al-Assad, the despot of Syria. And so the memory of the previous wave of the Arab Spring, was saturated with the conditions in Sudan, sparked this uprising. In the past month, the government that has now been put in place by the revolution, the Hamdan government, is normalizing the relationship with Israel. That's a contradiction that I think has yet to be resolved. The people have yet to be appealed, even if the mobilizations have subsided. That just means that it will kick off again, and there will be scores of people who have been through the experience of toppling a state and will have lessons from that. I think that connects with the United States as well too. We've had these massive uprisings that I think will not be appeased by Biden as president. Like that is not going to appease anyone. The conditions still exist. People have the experience of struggle. And so it's like, how do we as socialists, as radicals, generalize from that and sort of argue we need more like that? We need to push it further. We need to be better organized. We need more political education.
Well, that's all I got. Thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of Mondoweiss.net. The music you heard is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to subscribe to The Shift, a weekly newsletter from Michael tracking the shifting politics of Palestine in the United States. You can also sign up to get new headlines about Israel, Palestine, and related U.S. politics delivered directly to your inbox. If you'd like to support our work, go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help others find our show.